Welcome, everyone. And it's an incredible privilege to be in conversation with you today with the one and only Nathan Shepherd, someone who, like myself, isn't just focused on the why of social impact, why we need it, but also the how. And his new book, which I've got a copy right here, Nonprofit AI, a comprehensive guide to implementing artificial intelligence for social good, couldn't be any more timely. And Nathan, I really appreciate the special edition with my name on it here. That's really kind. I haven't seen that before, so this will be taking pride of place. And it's interesting because my own book, From Ideas to Impact, I argue that to close what I call the implementation gap in policymaking and social change, we need bold goals, community-led coalitions, and pragmatic tools. And Nathan, your book, I think, really offers exactly that through the lens of AI. And in your book, you write that AI adoption is inevitable, responsible and beneficial use is not. And we know innovation must be guided by values. Technology alone doesn't drive change. It's how we deploy it and who we bring with us. So for today's conversation, for everyone listening in, we're not talking just about the technology. We're talking about concepts like power, participation, and what it means to be mission driven in this new age of fast driven AI. So I'm looking forward to diving into it, and in particular exploring how nonprofits and mission driven organizations don't just survive but also thrive in this new era, and in particular how business leaders, philanthropists, policymakers, and everyday citizens can help make that possible. So Nathan, first things first, in the book, you write that AI is almost becoming the new electricity for the nonprofit world. And you write how many orgs are still feeling, however, that they operate in the dark. So what's the first mind shift that they need to become, as you write, an AI first nonprofit? And in particular, what does that even mean practically? And like what examples are there? What are we talking about here?
Right. Yeah. No, thanks, Mick, for bringing me on here with you. I mean, I'm a huge fan and follower of yours, and really just a cheerleader of your work. And so, I think where this new book, Nonprofit AI, really comes in some ways, is a follow up to my first book, which is The Generosity Crisis. And our work is very aligned in this idea of, there's these systemic declines in civic participation, and that we need a way to mobilize people at scale. And humans are amazing, and humans do amazing things, but we're not necessarily scalable on our own. AI, in what we conclude in our first book, is the only scalable solution to reversing essentially those declines. But we need practical ways to do that. And so nonprofit AI really came at the request of our publisher saying, can you have truly a guide to get people from step A to step B? And, we look at our sector, and, the social good sector is often a little behind the private sector. I mean, we don't really invest in philanthropic R&D very well. We tend to mitigate risk a lot. And so for a lot of nonprofits, they're just starting on their AI transformation journey right now. Whereas, the private sector is pretty deep into machine learning and deep learning and generative AI and agentic AI now. The nonprofit sector is just beginning. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing is really around, providing just, step one, step two, step three to say, try something new, but do it in a way that, puts trust at the center. And so there's a lot to unpack, and even your preamble. I mean, we're gonna have some time to unpack a lot of these things. When we think about the AI first nonprofit,
Yeah.
essentially it means that a nonprofit no longer looks at the barriers that once existed, that they are completely limited only by the human brain power and the human hands that they have at their disposal, that they now have this tool that knows something about everything, that can do almost anything, that if they create this AI first orientation, and whether that's just putting a post-it note on their screen that says, how can AI help? That, almost any action that they do when they think about amplifying their mission could be assisted by AI. And it
Mhm.
takes a while to break free from the way we've always done things, the way that, we've been taught to, gauge what the limits of our ability are just based on our own human cognition to think about, wow, we have this like PhD level assistant for anything that we need. And so right now it's in its most basic form is really helping nonprofits unlock that portion of their brain that lives often in that scarcity mindset.
So that brings me to this next question. And you mentioned it. I mean, and in the book, I mean, I was flicking through again this morning. There's so many use cases, both front of office, back of office, fundraising, admin, marketing. There's many in which you talk about. And I guess my question is, and perhaps people from nonprofits listening here online, you might be grappling with, well, if I'm new to this, like what is the low hanging fruit, right? And in the book, you write about fundraising, you write about the growing personalization and impact as a way where AI can help. But I guess first and foremost, like if you're going into this for the first time, if you're wondering where to begin, where to experiment, like where can you start? What's a way where you can quite quickly see some of the dividends and payoffs?
Yeah, I mean, and that's where AI becomes difficult for a lot of people because again, it's a technology that knows something about everything and can almost do anything. And so that becomes overwhelming just by itself, right? The complete overwhelm, we're faced with this tool that can just unlock all the world's answers. And I'm saying this, from conjecture, like it really can't, but
Yeah.
it seems like it can, right? And so for the average nonprofit, a lot of times it's not like the big sexy things. It's the things that are taking up time that are mundane or routine that just are a grind. And when we think about just pure efficiency, AI is an incredible efficiency tool. And that's not the thing that gets the headlines, but the reality is that, I started out 20 years ago working at small nonprofits. And if I like put that hat back on from my early days and I could think about sitting at my desk in this, moment of like, well, I've got, 8 or 10 hours today to do as much as I can. What if I could get 20% of my time back? And so at the very least, if a nonprofit can start to build kind of the AI first mindset with, themselves, their internal workforce, their advocates, their volunteers, and really empower this kind of creative brainstorm, the collective brainstorm that AI represents to gain a 20% efficiency back,
Yeah.
that's the dividend of time that is amazing. I mean, I've never met a nonprofit that couldn't use an extra day a week to be able to do, and hopefully, and this brings up lots of other, things, but to hopefully do human things, right? Not just more bad practices or transactional type things, but to actually take that 20% of that dividend of time and become more human and to use your real brain power to actually solve problems differently.
It's interesting. My co-founder at Global Citizen, he's a very gifted speaker, has a unique way of speaking, and because of that, whenever anyone in my team is writing speeches for him, it can be a lot of back and forth to get his tone right.
Hmm.
He likes to speak very clearly, digestible. He likes to give examples. He kind of has a formula that, depending on the subject, might change, but there's a general formula he likes to take his audience on the journey. So now my team, they've uploaded several of his previous speeches, like in terms of the structure and then the content and what they want to talk about. And then it produces a speech, like the first draft, very much in his speaking style. It's not generic, it's a tune. Even, he likes to speak in 3 points. And, there might still be some back
Right.
and forth, but the time it saves them from writing the first draft is just incredible. And it's actually pretty good. So, uh,
Yeah.
there's many use cases out there, but in particular, I do want to come to fundraising. Now, we've also used AI, to help speed up proposal writing, other forms of fundraising. But of course, you mentioned at the outset your previous work, the generosity crisis, and really your through line there is the fact that donations from individual households have been shrinking for a number of reasons the last couple of years. And so I guess can AI can AI, in your view, can it help reverse this trend, and how can nonprofits use it to increase individual donations?
Yeah, ultimately that ends up being the only conclusion. I mean, the data is fairly daunting. The decline in civic participation in mainly developed nations is pretty similar. So people become more atomized because essentially cell phones have made their way into a lot of people's hands, and that distraction, it's not by accident. That anytime you swipe on Instagram or TikTok, there's essentially an algorithm behind that that is essentially trained to capture your attention. So by design, the average person interacts with several thousand algorithms per day, and by design, those algorithms are essentially built to capture your attention. So the declines in volunteerism, the declines in advocacy, the declines in charitable participation are all the same, and the same as religious participation. It's all these things kind of go hand in hand. The reality is that while AI is kind of the culprit for doing a lot of those things, it also is the only scalable solution to reversing it. And so I spent 20 years fundraising, for small, medium, and large size nonprofits and international nonprofits. And the reality is, I think there's a lot of hope. The hope comes in the form of two pieces. One is around precision, and the other is around personalization. And so I started working in machine learning back in 2017 because I had this hypothesis that machine learning and deep learning advances in that data science could take large volumes of data and then start to predict, who is likely to most, do something. But for, you know, many decades now, most nonprofits have just basically been throwing spaghetti at the wall. They're looking at wealth data. Let's find wealthy people and convince them to make a gift.
Yeah.
Turned out, when we did our first data science project, wealth is actually a very low correlation to generosity. And so,
Mm.
we really disrupted what for 40 years has been essentially the norm in fundraising. So with that first side, that precision, we could take machine learning and deep learning to essentially answer a lot of questions like who's most likely to give, and then after that, when and how much and for what purpose and what way and all of that. The other advancement in AI became really exciting in 2022 when ChatGPT came out, and that solved for the idea that it was one thing to have great predictions, but without being able to activate those predictions in any kind of personalized way, it was kind of, one side of a two-sided coin. So with the advancement of generative AI, we've got predictive AI on one side, generative AI on the other side, and we get this new form of philanthropy called precision philanthropy. And precision philanthropy is this idea that each person is an N of one. Each person looks at an organization differently. And the way you look at that organization will change tomorrow and the next day and 2 months and 2 years. And if we deploy this technology correctly, we can essentially build, track your journey through your data and what you're engaging in and what you're not engaging in, and then build through personalization, a path that would really resonate the most with you, and not in a manipulative way, but in a way that feels like it's aligned with your values.
It's funny, what you touch on there is it almost speaks to something much bigger, right? Like you mentioned the decline in civic engagement. Robert Putnam, folks can
Hmm.
watch his movie on Netflix, which is Join or Die, and shows the thesis in the decline of people joining bowling clubs, Rotary clubs, all of that, and how that's linked to today's ills. And it's interesting because hearing you map about, you know, that desire to want to give, to be part of something bigger than ourselves, that still exists.
Right. Yeah.
And we shouldn't assume that the decline in giving, household giving, is a lack of that desire, because it's very much people may not know how. And I know you've spoken before about radical connection.
Hmm.
And I think what you're getting at is how AI may not just help nonprofits to connect and re-engage, build trust, build participation, increase individual giving, but also speak and answer to how we can meet that desire for purpose, for connection, for community. And I genuinely think that if we can do that, use AI, we might transcend these ills of division,
Yeah.
polarization that's plagued us. I mean, three-quarters of Americans desire that connection, even with people they don't always like or agree with. So yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know what you think about that, but just hearing you speak, I'm like, there's a bigger picture here going on.
Well, I think, even this advent of AI where anything is possible, and it actually becomes very overwhelming for a lot of people because all of a sudden, if you're just embraced with this idea that technology can answer all the questions that we've had seemingly, what is true anymore, right? And I think we see this a lot with Gen Z, and then I think we'll see it even more with Gen Alpha. But this idea of like what is true and what is pure, to your point, our brains are wired to give. I mean, our
Yeah,
biologically, for thousands of years, our brains are wired to be in community, they're wired to give. And we know this because when you help someone, either through a helping hand, or just buying a cup of coffee for someone, or you make a gift, or you advocate, your brain releases dopamine and serotonin. And that is just an indication that, by design, we are wired to be in community, and we're wired to be connected and to make a difference. It's the distractions and that competition for connection that we're facing at scale. So the same technology that has created, that atomization is also the same technology that can come back and actually bring us in closer communities if done well.
it's funny. One of my favorite reports that I highly recommend to folks listening is the World Happiness Report, which
Hmm.
comes out every year. And like you just said, it shows both how giving and generosity is part of our happiness. But the other thing it shows, this year's report, is that actually we're more pessimistic about the generosity and goodwill of our fellow neighbors and human beings, and is actually the reality, right? And so maybe this is where AI can help solve that and actually restore our faith in the very real goodwill and generosity that for most human beings is there and exists. But
Yeah.
I know there's probably people listening to this, Nathan, who are saying, well, hold on a sec, looking at the world today, and it's pretty messy and hairy out there, and AI is coming at this time, and is it really going to benefit most people, right? And so
Hmm.
let's talk a little bit about the potential downsides here, because both you and I have written about how AI can both distribute opportunity, but also how it could potentially concentrate it further, right? And I've written, for instance, about how even something as basic as lack of energy access across Africa, means that AI, could become another fault line in inequities that exist between the haves and the have-nots. And so you write about this in the book, but what are the ethical guardrails do you think are non-negotiable as non-profits adopting these tools, whether it's for fundraising, shaping policy, marketing, or back office administration? I guess in other words, how do we ensure that the future of AI in the nonprofit sector is not just, as you've said, efficient, but
Hmm.
also equitable and responsible?
Yeah, that became, an idea and an issue that I became worried about almost immediately when I started using AI back in 2017. And I remember this moment where I thought, I mean, it's so cliche, but with great prediction comes great responsibility. If I'm making predictions, is it my responsibility to, get a patent and protect that IP so nobody else can copy what I do? Or is it my responsibility to share that with everyone? And so that there could be collective accountability in how we build models to ensure that we're mitigating bias. And AI doesn't know the difference. I mean, it's a tool. It doesn't know the difference between manipulating someone and asking someone for a gift. It doesn't know the difference between biasing data sets on its own. It has to be guided by humans and essentially reflects the values that we humans put into it. And it became very clear to me that those designing these AI systems have very different incentives, right? And to your point, I mean, there's a chasm, right? The big 10 that essentially control most of AI globally, those companies are designing AI in not unresponsible ways. Sometimes there are cases of those and lots of lawsuits pending, but at the end of the day, they are building AI that serves their incentives, and those are largely capitalistic incentives. So it's not surprising that for every 1,000 papers written on AI scale, only one paper is written on AI safety. And so it's not surprising. We shouldn't be surprised that capitalistic markets are incentivizing growth and scale over safety. But what that means for the nonprofit sector that operates in the currency of trust, the social sector essentially is not rewarded in services and products in that same way. So in some ways, I think that provides our sector, the social sector, this superpower of clarity that the private sector can't have, just by design. That we can look through the forest, or look through the forest through the trees, and say just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. And I think it will be the social sector that will actually be the reason of the voice of truth and the voice of reason in this moment, to say, just because you can do something, because this technology will continue to present itself in magical ways, in ways that were never before imaginable, and that we'll see things that AI can do that will be just beyond our comprehension. And it will be our sector that will be like, hey, we don't have those same financial incentives. Before we do this thing, I think we need to pause and think and evaluate and maybe not use those things. It's much easier for our sector to actually have that clarity, to really understand just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. And I think that's something that we as a sector, we as humans need to almost habitually create a mechanism in our brains to say, just because my phone can do that thing or my computer can do that thing,
Yeah.
is it beneficial, not just in the short term, because it will appear beneficial in the short term, but how do we mitigate long-term harm and mitigate long-term consequences? And so that's just a new age that we're in, where we have to be the gatekeepers of equity, and make sure that these systems don't reinforce inequity and division. That AI, even though it will be built for capitalistic purposes, it doesn't mean that we have to use it that way. And so we got to stand tall and firm on this notion of being that voice.
I like that, being the voice of reason and the gatekeepers of equity, as you said. And, it chimes with something I wrote about in From Ideas to Impact. And there I wrote about the need for policy entrepreneurs,
Hmm.
people who can prototype new models under real world pressure, especially when the policy framework isn't ready and everything feels like it's being disrupted and in flux. And you've written a lot about AI fluency, fostering a culture of experimentation. So I guess just building on your previous comment, for those looking to be the voice of reason, the gatekeeper of equity, what advice would you give to a nonprofit leader who, isn't sure about how to take that first step, especially given how uncertain the current policy environment is right now? Where can they begin?
Yeah, I mean, the policy environment right now is super fragmented, right? I mean, from country to country. So, I mean, the EU has a decent AI kind of framework. The US has none. Australia has none. And so we're a lot of time left to our own, devices to figure this out. And, I think for the nonprofit sector, it's not an option to not use AI. So, using AI is inevitable, but how we use it is not. And so, going first to the recognition that responsible AI is everyone's responsibility. It's not Microsoft or Amazon or Google or a government's responsibility. It's our responsibility as individuals, the same way driving a car, it can be a very safe car, but you can't drive it irresponsibly and still be safe. The you know so the two things that nonprofits have to do, one is they have to have a willingness to experiment,
Yeah,
but they have to also do it in a way that mitigates long-term harm. And it's not that hard to do. AI actually is the thing that can help you do this. So if I were to say I'm a brand new nonprofit and I don't know where to start, first I would ask two things. I would say, okay, ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or Copilot or whatever you use, can you help create me an AI governance policy for my organization? And by the way, here are the values of my organization, and make sure the policy reflects my values. That's number one. And that one page, two-page policy will be a guide for you and your organization on how AI can be beneficial, and will tell you when to say no. The second thing is, okay, AI, I've got that. Now, how do I use you? Like, what are the things that you can do to help me in my support my mission or support my work at scale? And so, those are really two simple things that are in touch for most nonprofits. And if you have access to the internet, which, again, speaking of division, I mean, that's where the division lies. I mean, Microsoft will say, we want to get AI in the hands of every person on the planet, but, one third of the planet doesn't have access to the internet. So that's a separate thing. So we have to ensure that we're using AI that mitigates harm, that really provides access in the most equitable possible ways.
Yeah, and don't forget, in a world in flux, when the rules are still being
Yeah.
written, don't forget the power of the example and the power of that voluntary action, because you can actually shape those rules through the power of your example. Nathan, I guess we're coming up to the end here, but just looking ahead over the next few years, where do you see the biggest leap come in AI for social good over the next 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, we're about to enter this new age. I mean, we're in this age, whether people know it or not, where it's referred to as agentic AI. So agents, essentially AI that creates AI that takes action on, in multiple stages. That is going to be one of the biggest unlocks for what AI is capable of doing, because it's no longer just me sitting and prompting something to, to review it and then take an action. These agents scale AI at 1,000x, 1,000x. Like, I mean, it's kind of insane. I think with that, there is promise and potential that AI will solve for some of the biggest barriers that we've just not been able to do, that have been limited by human ability. But ensuring that they do that in a way that have human interest in the center is the biggest challenge. And so I think we'll see some really big breakthroughs in the next few years with AI solving for some really difficult issues. I mean, even if we think about cancer research and other types of medical research that needs massive brain power, we'll see huge advances there. But at the same time, um, I think we're going to also face challenges like we've never faced before, and go back to that idea of like using technology to make sure that it actually reinforces, human values, not just, utility.
And if you, I guess, last question, if you could have a magic wand and wave it around and have every nonprofit leader do just one thing today to prepare for this future you've just outlined, what would it be?
Yeah, I'd go back to, you have to try something. The need for innovation in our sector is paramount. The needs in our world are not getting smaller. That this is something that we are armed with an ability to solve for challenges like we've never done before. It's essentially irresponsible to not do this. I would go that far, but to do it in a responsible way. So my magic wand would be, create an AI governance policy. It will take you 15 minutes. Let it soak in. Make sure it serves as your guide. And then number two, every single day, put a post-it note on your screen that says, "How can AI help?" And every single day, learn something new and think of new ways to solve for challenges that were not solvable before.
Well, that's a good segue. On the subject of learning something new, just to everyone out there, you can follow this conversation more. You can check out my own book, From Ideas to Impact, and follow me online. And you can also take a screenshot of this QR code right now, and you can sign up to my newsletter, and I'll send you a bonus copy of my chapter, which is how to navigate these environments of disruptive innovation and hopefully do some good while at it. And of course, if you're interested in learning more and staying connected to Nathan, he's got his new book out, Nonprofit AI, which follows his best-selling book, Generosity Crisis. And Nathan, how can people stay in contact with you?
Yeah, they can visit my website, nathanchappell.com, nathanchappell.com. And we have actually some audio overviews generated by AI of both books. So you can get a sneak peek and a distillation of each of the books in 18 minutes or less.
Thank you. And you can follow me on LinkedIn, Instagram at Mick Sheldrick. You can also sign to my Substack, michaelsheldrick.substack.com. Find me on Audible, wherever you find your books, and really, really appreciate it. And with that, I want to thank everyone. If there's one takeaway I hope you've gotten from this conversation, it's that action is the antidote to apathy. There's a lot of things we can do. As Eleanor Roosevelt once said, the way to begin is to begin. And with that, I want to throw it back to Esther. Thanks, Nathan. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.